The first radar contact appeared for less than 4 seconds. Then it vanished. Not faded, not drifted out of range. It just disappeared off the screen like somebody physically unplugged it from reality. And that's when the USS Bunker Hill stopped transmitting normal traffic. Nobody on the bridge said the word Iran yet. They didn't have to, because every sailor in that combat information center already knew exactly where they were. The Strait of Hormuz at night feels wrong even when nothing's happening. Black water. Tanker lights scattered across the horizon. Oil smoke hanging low over the sea. The entire shipping lane so narrow that warships sometimes look close enough to touch. And right in the middle of it, 3 American destroyers had just changed formation without authorization. That was the first bad sign. The second was much worse. One of the helicopters never checked back in. Now officially, the Navy would later describe this as a temporary communications disruption, which sounds very calm, very professional. What actually happened was far uglier, because inside the CIC, operators were suddenly watching radar tracks appear where nothing should exist, while an SH-60 Seahawk, somewhere above the water, kept broadcasting broken fragments of panic onto an overloaded frequency. Then even that transmission cut out. Silence. Complete silence. And for about 30 seconds, nobody knew whether the helicopter had crashed or been shot down. Meanwhile, 80 miles north along the Iranian coastline, missile crews were already moving launch platforms under camouflage netting. Not preparing. Moving. Which meant something had changed before the Americans even realized it. And this is where the story gets strange. Because the U.S. Navy didn't sail into the strait expecting a fight. That's the public version people always misunderstand. This wasn't some dramatic invasion fleet charging toward Tehran with music playing in the background. It was actually supposed to be a pressure operation. Visibility. Presence. A message. Carrier strike groups do this constantly. You move destroyers through a choke point, park surveillance aircraft overhead, let satellites photograph everything, and quietly remind everyone in the region that the United States Navy can arrive anywhere on Earth whenever it wants. Simple. Routine. Except Iran had spent years designing an entire military doctrine specifically for this exact moment. Not to defeat the U.S. Navy outright. That's impossible. The Iranian strategy was something much more uncomfortable. Confuse them. Overload them. Force billion-dollar systems to react to cheap threats until the entire battlefield becomes psychologically exhausting. And honestly, it worked better than most people realize. Because by 2:14 a.m. local time, American radar operators were already tracking over 40 separate surface contacts moving between civilian tankers, fishing boats, patrol craft, cargo traffic, fast movers, some real, some fake, some deliberately broadcasting false transponder signatures. At one point, a radar operator reportedly tagged the same contact 3 separate times because its identification data kept changing mid-track. That's not normal. That's somebody playing games. And the problem with naval warfare in the Strait of Hormuz is that there's almost no room for mistakes. At its narrowest point, the entire shipping corridor compresses into a thin artery between Iran and Oman. Commercial tankers crawl through there nonstop, carrying roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply. Now imagine trying to distinguish hostile missile boats from civilian traffic in the dark, while radar clutter bounces off mountains along the Iranian coast. One officer later described the radar display as a Christmas tree having a nervous breakdown, which is funny until you realize anti-ship missiles were probably already active somewhere ashore. Then the destroyers slowed down. That confused everybody, because slowing down inside the strait is dangerous. It reduces maneuverability, makes formations predictable. But the lead vessel had received a sonar contact, very faint, below thermal layers, moving slowly. At first they thought it might be debris, then marine life. Then somebody noticed the contact was pacing the fleet. That changed the mood instantly, because Iran's submarine force is small. But in shallow water like the Persian Gulf, small diesel submarines become deeply annoying little monsters. They're quiet, compact, hard to track near coastal noise. And suddenly the possibility emerged that this entire surface swarm might only be a distraction. The bridge crews felt it immediately. You can always tell when sailors stop speaking casually. The atmosphere changes. People stop joking. Movements get tighter. Voices flatten out. And somewhere below the ocean's surface, a contact nobody fully understood was now matching speed with an American destroyer. Then came the helicopters. Or, at least, what was left of them on radar. Two SH-60 Seahawks launched to investigate the sonar anomaly. Standard procedure. One remained high for overwatch, while the other dropped lower toward the water scanning with dipping sonar. That's when Iranian coastal radar locked onto them. Now here's where people imagine Hollywood nonsense. Missile launches, explosions, jets screaming overhead. No, real military escalations often begin with something way more uncomfortable. A radar lock. That's it. No explosion. Just a warning tone inside the cockpit. And suddenly everybody knows someone ashore has decided you are now part of the battlefield. The Seahawk pilots immediately reported the lock. Command responded cautiously. Too cautiously, according to some officers later involved. Because nobody wanted to be the person who accidentally triggered a shooting war inside the world's most important oil choke point. So instead of escalating, they hesitated. And hesitation in combat zones creates weird little windows where nobody fully controls the situation anymore. That window lasted 6 minutes. During those 6 minutes, Iranian fast attack craft started repositioning along the northern edge of the strait. Not aggressively. That's the disturbing part. Calmly, disciplined, like they'd rehearsed it. Meanwhile, the American destroyers shifted into a tighter defensive geometry. Missile interceptors armed. CIWS systems active, electronic warfare suite scanning continuously, and still, that submarine contact remained underneath them, unidentified, uncomfortably close. Then somebody aboard the Bunker Hill noticed something worse. The Iranian boats weren't converging on the destroyers. They were tracking the civilian tankers. That changed everything, because suddenly this wasn't about attacking the U.S. Navy directly. It was about trapping them, and the realization spread through the fleet almost instantly. If civilian shipping became entangled in a military confrontation, American commanders would lose freedom of movement. Every missile intercept, every maneuver, every warning shot suddenly risked hitting commercial vessels packed with fuel. One officer later compared it to trying to defuse a bomb in a parking lot full of gasoline trucks. And right about here, the operation started falling apart. Not tactically, psychologically, because American commanders began recognizing something deeply irritating. Iran wasn't trying to win a naval battle. They were trying to create a decision-making nightmare. And honestly, that's much harder to fight. Back in Washington, Pentagon analysts were already monitoring satellite feeds from overhead assets. Infrared signatures along the Iranian coastline showed mobile launchers changing position every few minutes. Again, not firing, just moving, which forced U.S. commanders to constantly reassess whether an attack was imminent or merely implied. That kind of uncertainty burns through human concentration frighteningly fast, especially at sea, especially at night, especially when nobody has slept properly for almost 20 hours. Then the sonar contact disappeared. Gone. No acoustic trail. No propeller noise. Nothing. And for about 10 seconds, the CIC actually relaxed. Huge mistake. Because the contact hadn't retreated. It had stopped, right beneath them. That realization hit like ice water. One destroyer immediately altered course, while another accelerated hard enough to throw spray across the bow. And that sudden movement finally triggered the thing everybody feared most. Iranian missile batteries powered on simultaneously along multiple coastal sectors. Not launched, powered on, which is somehow even more stressful. Because now American electronic warfare teams could see targeting systems waking up across the shoreline, while civilian shipping continued drifting through the kill zone completely unaware. And then the helicopter returned. Barely. The SH-60 that vanished suddenly reappeared on radar south of the formation, flying dangerously low over the water. No response to repeated radio calls. No identification confirmation. Just a damaged helicopter limping back toward the fleet with half its external lighting gone. People initially assumed mechanical failure. Then the pilot finally transmitted 3 words: laser designation confirmed. That changed the entire operation, because it meant Iranian targeting teams had physically painted the helicopter with laser guidance systems. Not a warning radar lock anymore. Direct targeting preparation. The bridge crews understood immediately what that meant. Iran wasn't bluffing quite as much as everyone hoped. And this is where the midpoint of the whole encounter shifts. Because until now, most American commanders believed the destroyers themselves were the center of the confrontation. They weren't. The real objective was detection. Iran wanted to measure American response times, electronic signatures, formation changes, radar frequencies, helicopter deployment procedures. Every maneuver the Navy made under pressure was being recorded in real time. The destroyers weren't just projecting power. They were unintentionally revealing operational behavior. And once officers realized that, the mood turned ugly, because suddenly every defensive action felt compromised. Even activating certain radar systems exposed performance characteristics. At one point, an electronic warfare specialist reportedly muttered, "They're mapping us." That's when command ordered partial emission control, which sounds smart until you understand the downside. Reducing active emissions also reduces battlefield awareness. So now American warships inside the Strait of Hormuz were intentionally limiting some of their own sensors, while surrounded by civilian traffic, while being tracked from shore, while an unidentified submarine contact drifted somewhere below them. Not ideal. Then came the drones. Tiny ones. At first, operators thought they were birds. Low radar cross-section, erratic movement, small thermal signatures. But they kept appearing near the outer edge of the formation, one after another. Cheap surveillance drones. And suddenly billion-dollar destroyers equipped with some of the most advanced naval systems on Earth were being harassed by what essentially looked like flying lawnmowers. That's the humiliating part modern warfare rarely advertises. Sophisticated militaries hate cheap asymmetric systems because they force expensive reactions. Do you launch missiles at drones worth a few $100s? Use CIWS? Jam them? Ignore them? Every option creates problems. Meanwhile, the Iranian boats kept maneuvering calmly through tanker traffic like they had all the time in the world, which honestly made the whole thing more unnerving. Nobody yelling. Nobody charging dramatically. Just steady pressure. Like a chess player slowly reaching across the board taking pieces, while maintaining eye contact. Then the first real panic hit. A civilian tanker unexpectedly altered course directly toward the American formation after receiving contradictory navigation instructions. For about 30 horrifying seconds, the CIC believed the vessel might be weaponized or remotely manipulated. Weapons crews prepared engagement options immediately. Imagine being the officer who has to decide whether to fire on a supertanker in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. That decision alone could ignite global economic chaos overnight. Fortunately, the tanker corrected course. But the damage was already done psychologically, because now everybody understood how fragile the situation actually was. One mistake, one nervous trigger pull, one misunderstood radar contact. That's all it would take. And the worst part? The Iranian side seemed completely comfortable operating inside that uncertainty. Hours passed like that. Not battle, not peace. Something worse. A floating armed panic attack. The sea itself started becoming part of the problem. Morning haze rolled over the water, reducing visibility, while heat signatures from commercial engines distorted infrared tracking. People became exhausted. Operators started second-guessing contacts. At one point, 2 separate stations argued over whether a radar return was a patrol craft or wave interference. That's dangerous fatigue. Then the submarine contact came back. Closer. Much closer. This time acoustic analysts identified transient cavitation consistent with rapid maneuvering. The contact wasn't hiding anymore. It was repositioning aggressively beneath the formation. One destroyer deployed counter-submarine measures immediately, while another adjusted heading to avoid crossing directly over the contact. And then nothing happened. No torpedo. No attack, which somehow made it worse. because now commanders had to consider the possibility that the submarine itself was simply there to occupy attention while something else developed elsewhere. And sure enough, it was. Two American surveillance aircraft farther west suddenly detected unusual activity near Iranian missile storage facilities inland, not coastal launchers, deep infrastructure, fuel movement, reload logistics, reserve assets activating. The entire encounter in the Strait may have been partially designed to pin American naval attention forward, while Iran quietly repositioned strategic systems deeper inside the country. That realization hit commanders like a punch to the chest, because it meant the fleet had been reacting tactically while Iran operated strategically. Different game entirely. And once you see that, the earlier confusion suddenly makes terrifying sense. The radar games, the drones, the civilian traffic, the submarine shadowing, the missile batteries, none of it necessarily intended to start a war immediately. It was pressure architecture, layered stress, a live rehearsal with real weapons. And by sunrise, the U.S. Navy finally understood the uncomfortable truth. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer a place where overwhelming firepower guaranteed psychological control. The environment itself had become hostile, crowded, ambiguous, weaponized. Even the destroyers looked different by morning. Sailors exhausted, sensors overheated, helicopter crews drained from repeated launches. One officer later admitted the hardest part wasn't fear. It was sustained uncertainty. Human beings are terrible at remaining hyper-alert for hours without resolution. Your brain starts inventing threats. Or worse, missing real ones. Then, almost as suddenly as it began, the Iranian fast attack craft started peeling away, one by one. No dramatic retreat. No final confrontation. They just turned north and disappeared back toward the coastline. The missile batteries powered down shortly after. Radar locks faded. Drone activity stopped. And the submarine contact vanished for the final time. No explosion. No battle damage. No missiles fired. Just silence returning slowly across the water, which should have felt reassuring. It didn't, because nobody aboard those destroyers believed the encounter was really over. They just spent an entire night discovering how vulnerable even advanced naval forces become inside compressed, ambiguous environments designed specifically to exhaust decision-making. And somewhere along the Iranian coast, intelligence officers now possessed hours of electronic recordings documenting exactly how American warships reacted under pressure, formation timing, sensor behavior, helicopter response windows, communication patterns, little things, the kind of details militaries quietly kill for. By the time the destroyers finally exited the strait, the crews looked relieved, but not victorious. That's the important distinction, because this wasn't the kind of confrontation where one side dramatically wins. It was something colder, a demonstration that modern naval warfare may no longer begin with missiles. It may begin with confusion. And honestly, that possibility scared a lot of people more than an actual firefight would have. Because missiles are simple. You see them, you react. But uncertainty? Uncertainty crawls inside command structures slowly. It exhausts crews, distorts judgment, turns crowded waterways into psychological minefields. And somewhere out there beyond the morning haze, hidden among oil tankers and fishing traffic and fading radar clutter, somebody was probably already preparing the next encounter.